Great. Why don't I go ahead and kick us off here? I want to welcome you all to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. As so many of you online, Lori, good to be with you yesterday. Great to have a chance to be with you once a month on the second Wednesday of the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, the 9 a.m. Pacific time. Annie's morning sunlight beaming in there. So again, if you're new to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast, welcome. I encourage you all to go ahead and drop a recurring event into your calendar on the second Wednesdays of the month. And you will find us here each and every second Wednesday talking about all kinds of things stewardship related. I want to let you all know a little bit about the Stewardship Network if you are not familiar with us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, international and national award-winning organization. We've been around for 20 years. We have our geographically place-based member communities that are the backbone of what we do, and they do on-the-ground collaborative stewardship and learning and engagement events and in the Great Lakes in California and beyond. As I said, also our webcasts happen the second Wednesday of each and every month. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. And so we do that through all kinds of different ways. We mobilize through our member communities, as I said, our geographically place-based member communities, making ecological stewardship accessible to all. And we do all kinds of different things related to stewardship and caring for land and water in your communities. We equip people with all kinds of tools and resources so that they can be out on the land and water, caring for the ecosystems. Again, all kinds of different ways that we equip and amplify and accelerate and make more efficient the work that you all do on the ground. And we connect member communities so that we can share and learn from each other in so many ways, again, to accelerate and amplify the work that we do, right? If we can share both the successes as well as the learning opportunities that we have in terms of our, I'll do that differently next time. And so maybe you don't need to make the same mistake that we made. So again, we connect in all kinds of different ways. Monthly webcasts are one of them. We also, the conference will be virtual again this year. We hold an annual event that has been in person for more than 15 years, and we're going to stay virtual for one more year. I figure we need to get through a COVID-free winter before we can plan to bring 400 people in person inside for a few days. So we're going to go virtual one more time, and February 2nd and 3rd. So go ahead and save the dates for that. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Annie about California's 30 by 30 initiative and what that means and how that gives Annie and so many of us hope. So again, I want to introduce and thank Annie Burke for joining us, the Executive Director of Together Bay Area. She's also on the Board of Directors of the Stewardship Network. So Annie, thanks for being with us today. I want to encourage you all to go ahead and use the chat and drop in questions, comments that you have, drop them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll kick it off from here.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That's a great introduction, and it's really exciting to hear of all the things that the Stewardship Network is doing. And I'm really looking forward to the conference in February. Just wrote it down so that I write it on my calendar. So hi, everybody. I'm Annie Burke, and I'm going to talk today about California's 30 by 30 initiative, and I'm going to talk about hope. First, I want to introduce myself so that you know who this rectangle on your screen is. I'm born and raised in the Bay Area. My family is not of this place. I'm not a native to California. I'm a descendant of Scotland and Ireland, hence the name Annie Burke and the curly hair. I've lived all over the place, even though I'm about 1.5 miles from where I was born. So I am from here and I live in the place where I've spent, where I was born, but I also have left. Well, a few things I want to note about me real quick that you can see on the screen, but one is that I'm a baseball fan and October baseball is so good. I don't know if there's any baseball fans here, but I love October baseball in particular. And as Lisa mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Together Bay Area, which I'll explain in a minute. And I'm really honored to be a part of the Stewardship Network and supporting the work that Lisa, Rob, Bob, and the rest of the team do. So thank you for having me to be a part of this. And I'm also engaged in California's 30 by 30 Partnership Coordination Committee. So I'm kind of wearing a few different hats today. Let me tell you a little bit about Together Bay Area. We're a regional coalition of member organizations. So, and I distinguish a coalition from a network in that we really set goals as a coalition and work towards them. And our goals are focused around climate resilience and equity, and really around land, natural, working, urban, and rural lands. So our member organizations are nonprofits, Native American-led organizations, and public agencies, all who are working somehow to conserve, steward, manage land, as well as connect people to the land. And what that looks like really varies depending on the organization and their mission. But land is really kind of the common thread throughout all of our members. Our members are land trusts, water agencies, park districts, resource conservation districts, community-based organizations. There's too many organizational types to name them all, but it's a really powerful and diverse group of organizations. And we're in the 10 counties of the Bay Area. And for those who know the Bay Area a little bit, there are technically 9 counties that touch the Bay Area. And we also include Santa Cruz County because those mountain lions, they don't know where those county lines are. So we include Santa Cruz. We have 2 programs. One is an advocacy program, really focused on transformational funding and policies to enable both to support our mission as well as enable our members to do their best work. And we also convene. And we have, just like the Stewardship Network, we have online events. We also have in-person now that we're emerging, hopefully, knock on wood, from the pandemic. Just it's really interesting, actually, from a convening perspective, how much easier it is to convene on Zoom now. It has its pluses as well as its minuses. So that's a little bit about the work that we do. We also are the holder of the Conservation Lands Network, and that's a science-based, community-driven set of goals for biodiversity conservation. Started with this organization's predecessor called the Bay Area Open Space Council in the early 2000s, and has been updated pretty comprehensively twice, as well as a progress update in 2014. The most recent version of the CLN was released in November 2019, which I don't know about you, but it's like a different era. But it sets, with over 100 scientists and conservationists, the CLN sets over 2,000 goals for species and habitat. So it's not a property goal setting. It's not a, it's not a list of places that we want to conserve, ranked 1 to 100. It's really saying for biodiversity, for functioning ecosystems, what we need is to increase the existence of these certain species and these certain habitats. And one of the goals that it sets at kind of a macro level is to conserve 50% of the Bay Area lands by 2050. And we are working towards that, which we'll get to in just a second. If you want to learn more, bayarealands.org is the website. There's all kinds of fun stuff you can click on and play around in. Also, Together Bay Area is, as I mentioned, a coalition of nonprofits and public agencies, and very intentionally welcoming in Native-led organizations. And I want to bring attention to the 4 current members that are Native-led: Amamutsun Land Trust, Sagora Te Land Trust, the Moakma Ohlone Preservation Foundation, and Tamiya Nation. These 4 organizations are working to reconnect their tribes and their people to the land, and doing some really incredible work that I want to lift up. We always start our events and our conversations around acknowledging the land that we're on. And I invite you to do that silently to yourself. Think about where you are and on whose territory you are, the original stewards of this place. But I want to take the acknowledgement a step further and celebrate two things that have happened recently in California that I think are pretty exciting. The first is that the Yurok tribe recently signed an agreement with the California State Parks to co-manage the Redwood State Parks. These are up in Northern California, Humboldt County area, parks that are, some of a home to some of the biggest trees in the world. And this, it's a pretty big deal. It's a global MOU, and now they're working through different things to specify what that MOU includes. There's a link there, which I can share later if you want to learn more about it, and I highly recommend that you do. The second thing I want to celebrate is that the Segura Tay Land Trust recently signed an agreement with the city of Oakland to receive 5 acres of an existing park in the city of Oakland. And they used an interesting conservation easement, which I won't go into now, but to transfer, and I'm not sure that's actually the technical word, but to transfer rights from the city to a tribe. And I encourage you to check that out too. So not just acknowledging, but celebrating. Greta Thunberg, who I'm sure you all know, is about to come out with a book, and it's called The Climate Book. And one of the things that she talks about that I wanted to kind of set the table with is around honesty, integrity, and courage. That we're facing an uphill battle around this emergency that we're in with climate crisis, and that the inaction of today and yesterday must be compensated for in time that lies ahead. So that Secretary Wade Crowfoot from California Natural Resources Agency also talks about that the cost of inaction far outweighs the cost of action, that we need to do. It's time to go. And I just wanted to start with that kind of sense of urgency, but also sense of purpose and working together as much and as fast as we can. Also want to set the table with E.O Wilson, who I'm also guessing is familiar to this audience. He was an amazing human being, contributed a lot to our field, and in particular the idea of or the goal of conserving half of the earth, and that there are science and biodiversity reasons for doing that. And I encourage you to check out his book if you're not familiar with it, or there's this article for the Sierra Club magazine that is also really well written and easy to access. But there's also this second psychological argument for protecting half of the earth, and that we need large goals, while difficult, to potentially potentially game-changing and universal in benefit. And so there's the science part of 30 by 30 that I'll talk about in a minute. There's also the psychological and the mobilizing and the people part of 30 by 30, which I think is really important. All right, what is 30 by 30 in California? So in October 2020, our governor signed an executive order that laid out a commitment to conserve 30% of lands and waters, coastal waters, by 2030. And both the governor as well as the Secretary for Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot, have really been outspoken leaders on this. And that's an important piece that I'll come back to later on. And over 18 months between October 2020 and, let's see if I can do this math, I think it was December 2021, so 18 months-ish, the Natural Resources Agency, under the leadership of Dr. Jennifer Norris, conducted all kinds of engagement. You can see there on the screen so much. I mean, they were really working very hard to engage as many Californians as possible. And some of these regional workshops and public meetings went on for hours and hours. They made space for so many people to share their comments and participate. It was really impressive as a convener to watch them do that. And during also 2021, where there was lots of other things going on, and most of it, if not all of it, I think there might have been some in-person things, but Most of this was done online. And in December 2021, they released their Pathways to 30 by 30 document. And I encourage you to go check this out if you want to learn more. californianature.ca.gov is the website. And it outlines different pathways, which I'll explain in a second, to achieve 30%. There's a bunch of people who are involved in that. And I'm putting something together of this complexity and scale is not an easy task. And so just really want to acknowledge all the hard work that was put into that. I can only imagine what it's like to read through 4,000 comments and try to find something that then goes into a readable, accessible, digestible report. The Pathways document set out a conservation framework with 3 objectives. First is around biodiversity, protecting and restoring, expanding access to nature, and mitigating and building climate resilience. And so everything that we're working on now in Together Bay Area and across the state are really around these 3 objectives, which were very inclusive of lots of different ways of connecting, of conservation and of stewardship. The Pathways document also set out some core commitments around justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, around strengthening tribal partnerships. And this is something that Governor Newsom and the administration have taken very seriously. There's been some really exciting developments across the state, including the example I shared earlier around the Yurok tribe. And then there's also around economic prosperity, clean energy, food supply, conserving land is a multi-benefit, multi-dimensional undertaking. So taking those things into account. One of the biggest questions around 30 by 30 is how do you define conserved? And I'm going to guess, 1 million hours of conversation was had between all the people involved on what is that definition going to be? Because depending on how you define it, we're either at 1% or maybe we're at 100%, well, maybe not 100%, but there's depending on how you define it, really obviously sets the baseline, but it also there's so much of what's in and what's out. So the definition that CNRA has gone with, and the Pathways document, is that these areas are durably managed. Notice it's not in perpetuity. So durably managed and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and that they support the diversity of life. So that is how they've defined it. And to take that a step further, the state is using gap codes, and I'll share a link when I'm done around gap codes if you're interested. They're used by USGS, and they're, from what I understand, were established in the 1980s, and they have a pretty high bar for how that land is managed and what uses are allowed. So right now, the kind of the baseline, California has conserved 24% of lands and 16% of coastal waters. You all may have questions around the coastal waters, and I'm going to say right now, I'm not the best person to answer them. Coastal water conservation is like a completely different, I won't say animal, but I don't know if that's inappropriate when we're talking about biodiversity, but it's a completely different thing than land conservation. And there's some really great work happening with the Ocean Protection Council that I would defer you to if you have questions about that. But that with these gap codes, we're at 24%, so we have 6% to go, which I believe is around 8 million acres. One of the things that they've really emphasized in all of the work that the CNRA has put forward is around the importance of all conservation. So there's a balance here around accounting and counting acres and strategic acres, and the movement building of trying to really motivate and inspire and mobilize a whole state around conservation. And this is one of the areas where that gets tricky. I'm going to just Cool.
Question
Yep.
for you before you go on from here, the gap 1 and gap 2, can you explain a little bit about that? Those are currently conserved.
Those are currently conserved, and I when I'm done sharing my screen, I can pull up the definitions. Gap 1 is the highest ranking. There's 4 levels to gap codes, and the top gap 1 is that there are very limited uses allowed, as well as there are management plans in place.
Yep.
Gap 2, I think there's more public access, I think, allowed, and the management plans aren't required, is my understanding. But let me come back to that, because that's
that sounds great. That makes sense.
And it's a really good question, and again, there was a lot of conversation about it, because it's how the what's being counted is being defined, and so it's a big thing. But we'll come back to it. I'm going to touch real quick on coastal waters, in that there's a lot of work happening around the marine protected area system. Recently, there was an announcement around indigenous marine stewardship areas. 5 tribes from across the state are now working with the state to steward some marine areas, which is really exciting. And I'm just going to skip right over the coastal with lots of love and respect for all the people who work on the coasts. The pathways document outlined 10 pathways, as I mentioned, that regionally led conservation. And this really acknowledges that the work of conservation happens at the local and regional scale, and how conservation is done in Southern California and desert land is different than in redwood country. Different players, different funding, different land tenure situations. So how land can be conserved really varies on the regions. Acquisitions, for sure, is a big piece of this, if increasing the percentage of land conserved is the goal. Acknowledging easements and the role of voluntary conservation easements, not as the end goal, but as a way towards acquisition. I mean, that and towards conservation, that it's sometimes a process over many years. We need to enhance conservation. There's a lot of work in California around mitigation. Number 6, I really wanted to highlight for you, Lisa and the Stewardship Network, that Pathways calls for expanding and accelerating environmental restoration and stewardship. So while it's not about specific acres, this very clearly acknowledges that stewardship, what happens after land is conserved or protected, is really critical. And I hope that we can talk more about that when we get to questions. Coordination among governments, align investments, that there's a lot of different ways that land conservation is done, so that we need to have complementary conservation measures, and then of course evaluate. There's a lot I'm breezing through here. If you want to learn more about it, any of these things, jump into the Pathways document, and there's pages and pages of really good information. 2 more things I want to share about the 30 by 30 initiative itself. One is that it's got some fancy GIS and maps, which you can find at californianature.ca.gov. And there's lots of fun clicking you can do, turning on different layers and looking at things in different ways. So I encourage you to go check that out. It's really impressive work by Esri and by the folks at CNRA. And the red map here always kind of freaks me out a little bit. I can feel the heat from that one. Last thing about the partnership itself, or the initiative itself, is the who. There are a lot of people involved in reaching the 30% goal. It's about acquiring land, but it's also about stewardship and all those things outlined in the pathways. So we need funding, we need policies, we need researchers, we need land transactions. We also need partnerships with community organizations. So it really is a kind of all hands on deck, and ways, there are a lot of ways for different people to participate. And then over on the right on the screen is what's called the partnership. And there, those 5 bubbles around the outside are existing groups that play some kind of role in 30 by 30. And then there's a coordinating committee, on which I sit. And that coordinating committee helps serve as a communications conduit from local to the state, or from the state down to local, and then between these different groups. It's such a large state with such a complex system that it's really important that there's a lot of people who are involved. Together Bay Area is involved in a few different ways. One is through a conservation lands network. Another is around advocating for public funding and policies. And our role is really at the core. Together Bay Area is around convening and connecting. So that's a big piece of what we're doing. I'm going to fly through that in order to get to what's next. Before I get to what gives me hope, because a lot of this actually gives me a lot of hope, I want to acknowledge some of the tensions. I don't think these are solvable. They're just things we need to deal with and live with and figure out. I think of 30 by 30 as kind of, if it were a human, it has some flaws. It's not good at everything. And I love it anyway. So I want to acknowledge some of these challenging parts about it, because it's not it's not perfect or all rosy. One is that it's a really simple, and the simplicity and complexity. 30 by 30 is super simple, 2 numbers. Like, what could be so complicated? But as it gets down into implementation, it's incredibly complicated. And how you define conservation and what that means for different parts of the state is really complex. There's also a tension between perfect and good enough. And thinking about Greta Thunberg and what she's really calling all of us to do, especially adults, you know, we need to go, we need to move, we need to take action. So waiting for perfect actually works against us in the long term. Another tension is around different scales and who does what at what scale, local, regional, state, and federal. And then this tension that I'm guessing the audience is familiar with, of needing to hurry up and slow down at the same time. Slow down for building relationships and building trust, and hurrying up because the problems are big and we need to move. We need to take action. So what gives me hope? A bunch of things. And this is really where this is my last section of my presentation, and we'll move into Q&A. And I'm really excited it's really fun to put together slides around hope. One is that California Native Americans are involved in gaining power and resources. Not only is this good for them, it's good for all of us. The project Drawdown, which is a really great resource around how we draw carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground where it belongs, identifies that Native American land stewardship, or indigenous land stewardship, is really key to addressing the climate crisis. So this is about justice and equity, but it's also about sustainability and healing relationships with one another and with the planet. Makes me super, super excited. Another is that we have a common language. 30 by 30 gives us a common language across the state and a shared goal and a shared experience. So instead of kind of being like, well, LA is down there, I don't know what they're doing, we actually can talk to one another in language that we both understand. And that we get to build these relationships. We're one big state with very different regions, and now we can work together in ways that we really weren't set up to do before. And we're still kind of in the early stages of this. There's a lot more work we can do, but that is really exciting. And that some different parts of the region are at different levels of capacity. So how can we help build capacity where there isn't currently right now? What gives me hope? We know what we need to do. 30% by 2030, there's a really clear goal. And that also, one of the things that Together Bay Area members talk a lot about is like, what's new about 30 by 30? And in some ways, it's really not new. It's a new package around work that the conservation community has been doing for years and years and years. And once you kind of understand that, it unlocks us to be like, oh yeah, we can do this. We know what we need to do. in California, because of this initiative, I think we have a tailwind instead of a headwind. We have, I don't know what the right metaphor is, and the sailors maybe in the group can help me. That there's wind in the sails. There's political capital from the governor and the administration. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in public funding thanks to the state legislature and last year's budget, or actually this year's budget. And there's also a really easy story to tell. I don't need to get into what a conservation easement is or how land tenure is set up. We can talk about 30% by 2030, and it makes things so much easier. And the last thing for now that I want to share that gives me hope is that it's go time. Like it's really an exciting time to take action, to conserve land, to form partnerships, and that this is putting work that has typically been underappreciated in the shadows on the stage. And that's super exciting and something worth celebrating. Thank you very much. We're doing this for these folks and many others, and I really appreciate being here. There's my contact information as well as website for 30 by 30, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, Annie, thanks. Right, it is really exciting, and it's both and, as you say, it's complex. It's got its flaws. It's the work that all of us have been doing for a long time, and so the packaging of it is something that I also think there's something for people who may be not occupying this space to really just grab onto and say, oh, I see what we're trying to do, and I can understand the goal for it. Yeah. A question that Josh, native Californian Josh, asks is, are the 30 by 30 goals set at kind of the statewide scale or ecologically meaningful regional scales, right? I bet those are a million hours about what is conserved, and then, yeah.
Really, really good question. So one of the challenges of the 30 by 30 initiative was that they had about a year to put it together. Mm-hmm. And to do the ecologically based, scientific based assessment of this state was not going to happen in a year. And it was probably not best suited that the state government do that kind of regional and local work. So what the state did was set the percentage goals at the statewide level, and then is looking to the regions to set up regionally meaningful goals based on what's happening in the region. And that's where the Conservation Lands Network for the Bay Area comes in, where we know what species we want to conserve and what acres would be strategic and what acres might not be as strategic.
Mm-hmm. And then, Annie, beyond that, in terms of the map, and I'm looking forward to going and playing with this after we're done. I'm not going to multitask and go on that site, even though I want to. But what would you say are lands that might not be conserved by definition? Mm-hmm. Has there been conversation about that?
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're talking a lot about right now, actually. As this definition, as it's being rolled out, there's a lot of lands actually in the Bay Area that are not included, that we consider conserved. And some of those are lands that have been in public stewardship for 80 years. Some of them are water agency, they're watersheds that are used as storage, as well as collection for water agencies. And that's one of the things that we're figuring out right now is, so what does that mean? What does that mean for the state? And what does it mean for us here on the ground? And I don't know that answer yet, frankly, because it's a really interesting, we want to help the state be successful. And what works in the Bay Area may not be totally supportive of what's happening at the state. So it's a really interesting tension and friction right now.
Yeah, it is, right? Just in terms of how do you, Josh, you're getting at the crux of it in terms of that question.
Yep. What
about kind of the long term? So 30 by 30 is a goal. Mm-hmm. And, there's, like you said, there's a timeline. It's go, let's do it. We've got 6% more, 8 million more acres, and let's make this happen.
Yeah.
What's the conversation around long-term stewardship?
Answer is yes. I think that this is, I hear Secretary Crowfoot talk about this, and definitely Deputy Secretary Norris talk about it, but not in the first paragraph necessarily of their talking points, in that 30% is not the end all. It's not the goal. It is the goal. That's why it's not in the first paragraph. And that doesn't, like, we don't cross that finish line victorious, like, and done. Thank you. Let's,
right.
We're out. It's towards a half earth, it's towards 50%, and it's also, those lands need to be stewarded. And I don't, you all know this just as well as anybody, that conserving it is not the end, and that we really need to, I think, over these 8 years between now, or 7 point something years towards 2030, is really make sure that we're talking about 30%, and that we need to steward the lands. And make that shift from an acquisition framework to a ongoing land stewardship framework.
Yeah, I think that's the work that that we try to elevate and amplify, right? It's long term. It's like our own, the health of our own bodies, right? It's the same. It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'll just share what David shares. He says, I love this presentation. During the foreshadowing of the climate crisis, it was often said, we need to do this to mitigate the carbon issues. And it was always about future work, right?
Yeah.
And I'm excited that you said it's go time. I appreciate we are now in the time to do the work, and I'm excited to make it happen. And David, I am too, and so is the Stewardship Network, and I think all of us online are. And so I think that it's an exciting time to be able to say, we're in, right?
Yeah.
We're in and we're on.
I totally agree. I recall a conversation with Tom Robinson, who is one of my colleagues who helps, he leads the Conservation Lands Network work. He was asked, well, what does the Bay Area land conservation community need to do for climate change? And this was maybe 4 years ago or so, which is both pre-pandemic, but also in a very different time in terms of climate change conversation. And he said, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And the person who asked was kind of like, at first kind of disappointed, like, where's the new shiny something? And Tom was like, nope, what we do to conserve and steward land is what we need to do more of. We need healthy forests because they take carbon out of the air and they support biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. You could go through all kinds of ecosystems. So in some way, there's a lot of complexity in here, but there's also just some really powerful simplicity of, like, we know what we need to do, let's go do it.
Yeah, I think so too. And then for the work that we're doing, it's also an exciting time for us because the light is shining on us.
Yes.
So we've been doing this work, toiling alone in our labor, and now there are people saying, oh, what you're doing is just right. Keep it up.
That's right.
And we know that that's that long-term commitment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Here's a question for you about greenwashing. Since you mentioned greenwashing in your early slide. There's the whole piece of doing one thing and then saying another, any thoughts about 30 by 30 and greenwashing and where that goes? Just
yeah, I think what do I think? I think there's some critical thinking to do always. And when there's a big initiative that is that has political capital behind it, that is in some ways a marketing campaign, because as you just said, the 30 by 30 isn't creating something new. We need to think critically about what it is and how we want to engage. And this is something that Together Bay Area and our members have been really thinking about, is how do we, what is this thing? What is this 30 by 30 initiative? And what is it really? Like, not what is 30%, what is, not the nuts and bolts of it, but where does it start? What is its origin story? And in order for us to understand where it's from where it's born and then where it might go. And do we want to be a part of it? Do we want to support it and think really critically about that? Because it is, I think it played an important role in the state legislature allocating literally hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, I don't know, it might be $1 billion. I mean, it's like a lot of money to conservation, to our Wildlife Conservation Board and our State Coastal Conservancy. It's hard to say, nah, I don't want to be a part of that. When we can use, and I say use in a respectful way, when we can use the political capital and the simplicity of this campaign to advance our already existing work, that seems like a win. And again, it doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it means that it's really worth, for us at least, investing some calories in, because we can use it to advance our work.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So this kind of plays to some of, Steve, you ask a question that we don't know the answer to, but maybe some of you do online, but how does it play into America the Beautiful, the national effort? And great, Bob, I was hoping somebody would do that. So Steve asked the question of how many similar statewide efforts are out there. And as we were saying in online here for this, like, we actually don't know that answer, but it looks like Bob is dropping into the chat some of those links on that. But it is something that I think that we can all, it happens at that large national level, the global level of E.O. Wilson's, half Earth, and then, but it's got to be meaningful locally, right? And that's where that happens.
Yeah, and maybe in your state, wherever you're zooming in from, 30% doesn't actually make sense.
Yeah.
There are some states that already have 30% or more conserved, depending on how you define that. And I think there's some components of California's initiative that are transferable. Creating a common language, setting a goal that is easy to understand, building connections across the state for different regions to work together. Some of the things that I think give me hope about California's 30 by 30 initiative are easily transferable to lots of different contexts and scales. And so I think even if 30 by 30 doesn't make sense for your state or your region, what else could you do or could be done to really advance the work in the way that 30 by 30 is here, but in a different context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Bob, thanks for dropping those in the chat. There is, as I say, there's momentum on this, right?
And I'd love to, I look forward to clicking the links, which I'll do after we're done, because I'm not going to multitask well, but I would love to hear from other states. I wonder if there's a 30 by 30 state Congress, that could form to share stories. And maybe my colleagues at California Natural Resources Agency are already doing that work. I don't know, but I'd love to learn.
Exactly. And as you said, it was only relatively recently that this goal was put in place. And so then all of the component parts, start to get developed. And so, that's great. What do you think about, so back to this kind of, state Congress on 30 by 30 initiatives, what do you think are the things that you all have done well? Mm-hmm. And what are the things that you think you could say you can learn from us, and so you can accelerate your efforts by not, spinning the wheels the way that we did, or whatever that is?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think has gone well is moving relatively fast to put something together, to build momentum with this administration in office, with the state budget surpluses as they are. There really is kind of a moment happening in California in terms of climate resilience across all kinds of components of that, but also around natural and working lands and their role. So there's some, seize the moment when you can. And I think that's something I would say emulate if you have that, if the stars are aligning in that way where you are. One of the things that's challenging that I would, if advice I would give is to really ground it in science. And that's challenging for a large state like a large populace as large landmass state like California, which is so biologically diverse. But it's so important to know what are we actually conserving for? I mean, who are we trying to, what plants and animals are we trying to conserve? That's not what I mean by who. And to be really clear about that, because one of the things that's happening now is that the conversation is just about acres.
Yeah.
And that, for the past 25 years or so, I don't know when it started, we're trying to move away from bucks and acres. We're trying to move away from like how many dollars, how many projects, and how many acres are we conserving? Because that actually isn't as important as what species are being conserved or the connectivity between conserved lands and that kind of thing. So to whatever extent science, as much science as possible to be involved so that it isn't to move us beyond the kind of just the acres.
Yeah, no, and that goes back to Josh's early question about, is it acres at a statewide scale, or is it ecologically meaningful regional scale? And that's, again, as we're acknowledging, it's in the infancy of this goal. And so maybe some of those kinds of things can evolve in really cool ways to really be saying, these acres actually are really important and critical, and let's do that.
Lisa, you're making me think actually in your response about how if we remember that they're human beings who are putting this together, and that those human beings, have families and lives and do other things besides this, that the kind of the tendency to say, but they didn't do this, or they didn't do that, or like, well, but it's not, they didn't include this piece that I think is really important. And that it's an ongoing process that, like, straight out of the gate, you don't often get things perfect. And the important thing is that we're leaving the gate, that we're doing something, and that there's time to adjust.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really important. And those of you online have heard, one of my mantras of it's easy to break a glass. It's easy to just throw criticism at an effort and just smash that glass to the ground. But what we're trying to do is make the glass, and that takes a lot of work and elegance and time, right? To create this vessel that will be durable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think about, what are the, we're talking a little bit about this, but what are the stewardship opportunities, right? So there's the whole conserve land. And then I think the work that so many of us are into is the long-term stewardship. We know it's for the long game. We know it's, as your colleague said, keep doing what you're doing. You know it. Right. And where do you think that momentum will go? I was giving a talk one time about, I think the title of it was something like Conservation 2.0, but I really feel like we're standing on the shoulders of those who did things like 30 by 30, but also conserved lands and set land aside. And so we know that we need to care for it in order to preserve its ecological and cultural value that made it valuable in the first place. And I think that work is so important. And it's long-term, and it's multifaceted, and you get to know it and understand it. And as you said, we evolve in kind of what we know scientifically and ecologically is important for that kind of stewardship. And then that cultural connection that we have to the land and what that can do for communities and individual people.
Yeah, I think one thing it can mean for people and organizations and groups who are focused on stewardship is that there's a easy to tell story to hold on to. The simplicity of 30% by 2030 could be seen as a window or a door for people to enter your work and to come into stewardship, and to, hey, have you heard about this 30 by 30 goal? Cool, that's what we're working on here by restoring this creek. And that it's part of a larger movement of taking care of this place, for example. So I think without kind of taking it and not thinking critically about it, I think it's really important, or there's a really cool opportunity, I think, to ride some of the wave that's happening, at least here in California, if not other places, where we can make it easier for people to become land stewards. We can talk in easy language, clear language, not, scientific names of plants language. And that, I think there's an opportunity there. I'm hoping that the 30 by 30 initiative over the, between now and 2030, one of the evolutions it will go through is providing us all, and Jen Norris would say that she's going to want our help in creating this. So I can't put it all on resources agency, but is, how do we have that conversation more intentionally around conservation and stewardship? How do we make that more accessible to more people so that we bring more people into the movement and into the work? And I think that's one of the, most people are so disconnected from the place they live. Yeah. And so disconnected from the value of trees for our own personal health, and the health of this, so how can we use this and other campaigns to make that connection? I think there's opportunities there.
I think our team at the Stewardship Network is excited about that too. I mean, that's what our spring challenge is all about. Connect to nature, and put your hands in the dirt and the water, and understand that there's a role for us to play, not only in the active stewardship, but it's reciprocal. It gives back, and
that's right.
Yeah. So what happens in 2030? So I know it's early in the stage, but let's fast forward and let's say we've done that. Is there any talk? Is it too soon to be talking about this? But what is it? Is it 50 by 50? Is it, what are your thoughts about that?
That's such a fun place to go. I hope that it is. I hope that there's some serious celebration. I mean, I hope that there's some large conference center with a lot of people in person, I don't know, with a band or a DJ, and that there's a party to celebrate achieving 30%. I also hope that there are field trips across California to get out on the land and see what has happened in these 8 years to really connect. So that's not just connecting people, but connecting people to place. And I hope in 2027-ish, we start talking about what's next. What is the next phase, and how do we, continue to ride the wave while ensuring that the wave is, mixed metaphors, is well funded and supported, so that it is 50%, and that the stewardship component is right there at the front, so that it isn't just about acres, but it is also about stewarding the land, and who is stewarding the land, and how is the land being stewarded. So it's, again, not just creating another checkbox of yes, stewarded, but that the relationships and reciprocity that you just mentioned are built in there. So absolutely. I think we keep going.
I know, right? That's great. Exactly. In it for the long haul, in it for future generations. I was part of, I was doing a Lake Plain prairie restoration, and I was like, this is, I think, grandchildren benefit, right? Yeah. This is not my generation. This is long term.
Yeah. So one parting thing I just on that note, and I'll say it really quickly, is I think there's a really fun exercise to think about how, pick a kid that pick a child today who you love, and what is that child going to be doing when they're your age today? What does the world look like then? And let's do the work to make sure that that child is on that trail and get outside and living in a healthy place. So descendants and ancestors is very much alive in the work that we're doing.
I love that thought. Just pause there and just appreciate that, right? Yeah. How do we create that space?
Yeah.
Well, Annie, thank you so much for sharing this. Thanks for the work that you're doing, as always. Totally appreciate it. Thank you all online. I want to appreciate and the time that you've spent with us. We really value that and are so glad that you're here spending this hour with us. As we wrap up and let you, the top of the hour, let's get you out a little bit before the top of the hour, so you maybe have a moment to pause before your next top of the hour thing. Want to remind you all that registration will open for the Stewardship Network conference very soon. I'll get this in presentation mode, and that again will be back online second Wednesday of the month during the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. November 9th, we'll be talking with Lisa Marie Rodriguez. As we know, stewardship takes many different forms. And so Lisa has been doing stewardship with the urban neighborhood initiatives in Southwest Detroit. And again, just thank you for your time. Totally appreciate it. And we'll look forward to being with you again.